something changed at Dollar Tree in the last 30 days, and I don't think enough people are talking about it yet. I kept every single new item I bought last month, still sitting in a box in my closet, and when this week's new arrivals hit the shelves, I did something I've never actually done on this channel before. I went home, pulled out last month's haul, and lined every single item up side by side against this week's equivalent. Same category, same basic function, direct head-to-head. I expected maybe a couple of small improvements here and there. What I actually found was a consistent, almost surprising upgrade running through nearly every single comparison. Better materials, smarter design, in a couple of cases, genuinely shocking jumps in quality for the exact same price point. I'm walking you through all 12 side-by-side comparisons today, in order from the smallest improvement to the single biggest jump I found in this entire test. So stick around, because comparison number 12 is going to make you seriously reconsider anything similar you already bought last month. And I genuinely mean that. It's not just a line to keep you watching. Quick note before we start, I bought everything specifically to keep, not to return, so every single item in both boxes has been sitting in my house, getting real honest use over the past several weeks, not just a quick out-of-box glance the day I bought it. I also want to be upfront that this wasn't planned as a series when I bought last month's haul. I genuinely just happened to still have everything sitting around when this week's new arrivals caught my eye, and the moment I noticed the first small difference, I knew I had to go back and check every single category rather than just the one that first caught my attention. Comparison 1. Storage bins. Last month's version was a basic, plain plastic bin, functional, nothing more, with a simple snap-on lid that required a firm push to close and an even firmer tug to open, the kind of item you buy without thinking twice about it, because every version, at every store, basically looks and functions the same way. This week's version, same basic size, same price point, has redesigned side handles that make carrying it dramatically more comfortable, along with a lid that clicks into place with noticeably less effort while still sealing just as securely. Side by side, the difference is immediately obvious the moment you actually pick both of them up. It's a small upgrade in the grand scheme of things, but it's exactly the kind of quiet improvement most people would never notice unless they happen to have last month's version sitting right next to it, for direct comparison the way I did. I actually had my partner try opening both blind without telling her which was which, and she immediately identified the newer one just from how much easier the lid released. Which honestly told me this wasn't just me imagining a difference that wasn't really there. I also stacked 3 of each version on top of one another to check if the redesigned handles affected how securely they nested together for storage, and thankfully the new design still stacked just as cleanly as the old one, so the improved handles didn't come at the cost of anything else. Comparison 2. Jar candles. Last month's candle had a single centered wick and a fairly basic unscented adjacent fragrance that faded fast, barely noticeable in a room larger than a small bathroom, exactly the kind of candle you'd light more out of habit than any real expectation of it filling the room. This week's version, again at the exact same price, comes with 2 wicks instead of 1, throwing noticeably more scent throughout an actual living room-sized space, and the fragrance itself smells more complex, layered, less like a single flat note, and more like something you'd actually pick out intentionally at a specialty candle shop. Lighting both side by side in the same room, the difference in how far the scent actually traveled was honestly kind of dramatic for something this inexpensive. I actually left the room for 10 minutes and came back specifically to judge which scent hit me first walking back in. And it wasn't close. This week's candle was noticeable from the hallway, while last month's version barely registered standing directly next to it. I also let both burn for a full 2 hours side by side to see how evenly they melted down, and the dual wick on this week's version created a noticeably more even wax pool across the entire surface, while last month's single wick left a deep well in the center with unmelted wax, still clinging stubbornly to the outer edges of the jar. Comparison 3. Kitchen towels. Last month's set felt thin, almost scratchy against skin, the kind of towel that does the job but never feels particularly pleasant to actually use, the sort of towel you keep folded in a drawer and reach for only when the nicer ones are already in the wash. This week's version uses a noticeably softer, more absorbent woven fabric, genuinely comparable in hand feel to towels I've bought at specialty kitchen stores for several times the price. I tested absorbency directly, spilling the same amount of water on my counter and timing how long each towel took to fully soak it up, and this week's version finished the job almost twice as fast. Genuinely surprising for what's still technically the same basics budget kitchen towel category. Running my thumb across both fabrics side by side, the texture difference alone was obvious enough that I didn't even need the time test to know which one I'd rather actually keep using every day. I also washed both towels together 5 separate times over the course of the month specifically, to see how each one held up, and last month's towels started fraying noticeably at the edges by the 3rd wash, while this week's version still looked and felt essentially brand new by the 5th. Comparison 4. Phone charging cables. Last month's cable felt thin and a little flimsy where it met the connector, the exact spot where cheap cables typically fail first after a few weeks of regular bending and unplugging. And honestly, the kind of detail I'd normally never think to check closely on a cable this inexpensive. This week's version has a visibly reinforced connector joint, thicker, more rigid material, specifically at that stress point, which should genuinely extend how long it lasts under normal daily use. I bent both repeatedly at that exact joint specifically to compare flexibility and durability. And this week's version held its shape noticeably better, without that early warning sign of fraying that budget cables usually show first. After about 50 deliberate bends at that same stress point on each cable, last month's version already showed faint white stress lines starting to form near the connector, while this week's version showed essentially none. I also plugged both into the same charging brick and measured actual charge speed with my phone at 20% battery. And while the difference was small, this week's cable delivered a slightly faster, more consistent charge, which suggests the internal wiring quality improved right alongside the visible casing. Comparison 5. Individually wrapped snack packs. Last month's bag felt a little light in hand, and after actually counting, the pack contained 8 individual snack bags, a number I only actually checked because something about the weight felt slightly off compared to what I remembered from other multi-packs. This week's version, same exact price, same exact packaging size on the shelf, contains 10 individual bags instead, a genuine 25% increase in actual product for 0 increase in price. This is exactly the kind of change most shoppers would completely miss unless they specifically counted, the way I did side by side with both bags open on my kitchen counter at the same time. I actually recounted both a second time just to be sure I hadn't made a mistake the first time around, since a change like this seemed almost too generous to be real, but the numbers held up exactly the same on the second count. I also weighed both bags on a kitchen scale just to see if the individual bags themselves had gotten smaller to compensate for the extra count, and each individual bag weighed essentially the same as last month's, meaning this genuinely was more total product rather than the same amount simply split into smaller portions. Comparison 6. Greeting cards. Last month's card used a thinner paper stock that felt slightly flimsy, folding it open. The kind of card where you could faintly see shadowing from the printed design on the inside through the front cover if you held it up to light, a flaw that's easy to overlook until you're actually holding a better version right next to it. This week's version uses a visibly heavier cardstock, more substantial in hand, with 0 see-through shadowing even under a bright light. For something that's fundamentally about the sentiment inside, rather than the paper itself, this is a small change. But it's exactly the kind of small change that quietly makes a gift feel a little more considered without costing you anything extra at the register. Holding both cards up side by side against a window, the shadowing on last month's version was genuinely distracting. Once I actually noticed it, the kind of small flaw you don't consciously register until a better version sits right next to it for comparison. I also folded both cards shut and reopened them repeatedly about 20 times each to check whether the thicker stock on this week's version would crease or crack along the fold line faster, and if anything it held up better, keeping a cleaner, sharper fold than last month's thinner card managed by the end of the test. Comparison 7. Woven storage baskets. Last month's basket had visibly looser weaving in a few spots, small gaps where you could see slightly uneven spacing between the woven strands, the kind of construction flaw that looks perfectly fine from a normal viewing distance across a room. This week's version has noticeably tighter, more consistent weaving throughout, giving it a more finished, higher quality look sitting on a shelf. I actually held both up to a light source specifically to compare how much light passed through the gaps in the weave, and this week's version let through visibly less. A simple, direct way to confirm. The tighter construction wasn't just something I was imagining. This is exactly the kind of detail that photographs completely differently do. Something worth keeping in mind if you're using a basket like this and pizza in your home rather than tucked away in a closet. I actually loaded both baskets with the exact same stack of folded towels to see if the tighter weave on this week's version affected how well it held its shape under weight, and it genuinely stayed more rigid and structured, while last month's looser weave sagged slightly at the sides once fully loaded. Comparison 8. All-purpose cleaning spray. Last month's bottle had a basic trigger sprayer that occasionally clogged mid-use, requiring an annoying extra pump or two to get a consistent mist going again. One of those small daily frustrations you just learn to work around without ever really questioning it. This week's version has a redesigned nozzle that produced a noticeably more even, consistent spray pattern across every single test pump I tried. Zero clogging issues across an entire bottle's worth of testing. It's a small mechanical detail, but if you've ever dealt with a frustrating clogging spray bottle specifically, you know exactly how disproportionately annoying that small flaw actually is in daily use. I sprayed each bottle roughly 40 times in a row, specifically to stress test the nozzle mechanism, and last month's version clogged twice during that stretch, while this week's version never once hesitated. I also compared the actual mist pattern by spraying each onto a paper towel from the same distance, and this week's version produced a noticeably finer, more even mist covering a wider area, while last month's came out in a more concentrated, slightly uneven stream that left visibly wetter patches in some spots than others. Comparison 9. Seasonal decor pieces. Last month's piece used a thinner, slightly flimsier plastic material that felt a little hollow tapping on it, with a fingernail, a small tell that's easy to miss, unless you're specifically holding two versions and comparing them side by side, rather than judging one on its own. This week's version uses a noticeably heavier, more substantial material, giving it real weight and a more premium feel, sitting on a shelf or table. Tapping both side by side, the sound difference alone was obvious, a duller, more solid thud from this week's version compared to the hollower, thinner sound from last month's piece. For seasonal decor specifically, that weight and material quality genuinely changes how premium something feels the moment a guest actually picks it up. I set both pieces out on my own coffee table for a small gathering specifically to see if anyone noticed unprompted, and two separate people picked up this week's version specifically, commenting on how solid it felt, without me ever mentioning there was even a comparison happening in the first place. I also checked both pieces for paint quality under a bright lamp, and this week's version had noticeably more even, consistent coverage across every edge and detail, while last month's piece showed a few thin patches where the base plastic color peeked through slightly along the raised details. Comparison 10. A basic skincare serum. Last month's formula listed its key hydrating ingredient further down the ingredient list, typically a sign of a lower concentration relative to filler ingredients, something most people would never think to check, unless they already knew to read an ingredient list that closely in the first place. This week's version lists that same key ingredient noticeably higher up the list, suggesting a meaningfully higher concentration in the actual formula itself. I patch tested both on the same day, one on each arm, and while this obviously isn't a scientific lab test, this week's version genuinely felt more hydrating within the first hour. Less noticeable dryness returning by the end of the day compared to last month's version on the other arm. I repeated this same side-by-side test a second day, just to rule out one arm simply being more prone to dryness naturally, and the results held up consistently both times, which gave me real confidence this wasn't just a coincidence or a placebo effect from knowing which formula was supposedly newer. I also compared the actual texture of both serums on my fingertips before applying, and this week's version felt noticeably thicker and more substantial, less watery than last month's formula, which lines up with that higher ingredient concentration listed on the label. Comparison 11. A small kitchen gadget, specifically a garlic press. Last month's version was a single-function press. Garlic in, minced garlic out. Nothing more. And honestly, the kind of tool most people already own without thinking too hard about which version they picked up. This week's version includes an added cleaning tool built right into the handle, a small attached pick specifically designed to clear out stuck garlic from the press holes, solving one of the most universally annoying parts of owning a garlic press in the first place. Testing both back-to-back on the same amount of garlic, cleanup on this week's version took a fraction of the time, Thanks to that one small, thoughtful added feature that last month's version simply didn't include at all. Anyone who's ever stood at a sink digging stuck garlic pulp out of tiny press holes with a toothpick knows exactly how disproportionately satisfying a small fix like this actually is once you finally have it. I also checked whether the added pick tool weakened the handle at all, since adding a moving part to a simple tool sometimes introduces a new point of failure. But after pressing a full head of garlic through both versions repeatedly, this week's handle felt just as sturdy as last month's single-function design, so the improvement genuinely came at no real cost. And finally, comparison 12, the biggest jump in this entire test, a pet chew toy. Last month's version was a fairly simple, single-material rubber toy, functional, but nothing that stood out, exactly the kind of toy that ends up forgotten under the couch within a week of bringing it home. This week's version is a completely redesigned multi-texture toy, combining rubber with a rope element and a small internal squeaker, essentially 3 toys worth of engagement built into one product at the exact same price as last month's single-feature version. I tested both with the same dog on 2 separate days, specifically to keep the comparison fair, and the difference in engagement time was dramatic. Last month's toy held interest for maybe 10 minutes before being abandoned, while this week's version kept that same dog actively engaged for well over half an hour. If you only check one single comparison from this entire list before making a decision, let it be this one, because the jump here genuinely isn't subtle the way most of the others on this list were. Watching that same dog completely lose interest in last month's toy within minutes, then immediately perk back up the moment this week's version came out, was honestly one of the clearest, most convincing side-by-side results in this entire test, no measuring or timing required to see the difference play out in real time. I also checked the stitching and material seams on both toys after that half hour of active chewing, and last month's toy already showed a small loose thread starting to pull at one seam, while this week's version, despite the added rope and squeaker components, showed no visible wear at all after the exact same amount of use. So here's what all 12 of these comparisons add up to. This isn't one lucky upgrade in one single category, it's a consistent pattern running across kitchen goods, beauty products, home decor, pet supplies, and basic school and office items, all showing meaningful improvement over what was sitting on these exact same shelves just a month ago, all at the exact same price points as before. I don't know for certain what's driving this specific wave of improvements behind the scenes: better supplier negotiations, a broader quality push across the company, seasonal timing bringing in fresh product lines, but whatever the actual cause is, the result on the shelf is genuinely noticeable once you take the time to actually compare it directly the way I did this week. One item at a time, side by side, with nothing left to guesswork. What surprised me most putting this whole comparison together wasn't any single item on its own. It was how consistent the pattern turned out to be across categories that have absolutely nothing to do with each other. A candle and a phone cable don't share a supplier, a factory, or really anything at all, so seeing genuine improvement in both within the same 30-day window suggests something broader is happening rather than one specific product line just happening to get a refresh. If this had been 2 or 3 items showing improvement out of 12, I'd have chalked it up to normal, routine product rotation, the kind of thing that happens constantly and rarely means much on its own. 12 out of 12 is a different story entirely, and it's exactly why I felt this was worth an entire video rather than a quick mention buried inside a normal haul. And honestly, the more I sat with the results afterward, the more convinced I became that something genuinely structural had shifted rather than just a handful of coincidental refreshes landing in the same month by pure chance. If you kept anything from last month's haul yourself, I'd genuinely encourage you to do this same kind of side-by-side comparison the next time you're back in store. Because based on everything I found putting this list together, there's a real chance you'll notice the same pattern I did. And if you don't have last month's version anymore to compare directly, that's honestly fine too. Just know that what's currently on shelves right now appears to represent a genuine step up from where things stood even a few weeks ago. I also want to be honest that not every single item I checked showed improvement, since I did look at a couple of other categories that didn't make this list because the difference was either non-existent or too minor to confidently call a genuine upgrade rather than normal manufacturing variation between batches. I'm not including those here because I don't want to stretch a real, honest finding into something bigger than it actually is. just to pad out a bigger list. 12 genuine comparisons felt like the right, honest number to bring you, rather than reaching for a few weaker ones, just to round things out to a bigger total. Before you go, I want to try something a little different for the next video. Comment below with which specific comparison from today's list surprised you the most, and also, let me know if you'd want me to keep doing this exact side-by-side format going forward, comparing this month against next month, building an ongoing record of how quality actually shifts here over time, instead of just covering whatever's new in isolation every single time. This kind of comparison takes real effort, saving items, testing them properly, waiting a full month before actually filming, and knowing there's genuine interest in seeing it continue is exactly what would keep me doing it regularly, instead of as a one-off experiment. I'll admit keeping an entire month of purchases untouched, specifically for a comparison like this, takes more discipline than it sounds like on paper, since normally I'd have already used up half of what I bought, long before a follow-up video like this ever crossed my mind. Setting a box aside, resisting the urge to just use things normally, and actually tracking which items came from which specific trip meant treating this month differently from the start, and I only decided to actually film it once I realized just how consistent the improvements were turning out to be across nearly everything I'd saved. If you're new to this channel and found this kind of detailed, honest comparison useful, subscribing means you won't miss next month's follow-up, which I'm already planning to film the exact same way, saving today's finds specifically to compare against whatever shows up on these shelves next. I'd also genuinely appreciate a like on this one if it was useful, since a video like this takes noticeably longer to put together than a normal haul or restock update, and knowing it actually landed with people makes it a lot easier to justify doing the extra work again next month. Thanks for watching all 12 of these comparisons through to the end. I know it's a longer, more detail-heavy video than what I usually put out, and I genuinely appreciate anyone who stuck with the whole thing, and I'll see you next month for round 2.